You wouldn't think much of the quiet woman serving coffee at a dusty roadside diner off Highway 87 in West Texas, but then again, that's exactly how Emily Carter wanted it. At 35 years old, Emily moved through the narrow aisles of Lonnie's diner with practiced precision, balancing plates of pancakes and refills of black coffee with a calm that made her seem invisible to most. Her dark hair always pulled back in a plain ponytail, and her loose white button-down shirt did little to conceal the scars that trailed up her neck and across her left arm. Customers glanced, whispered, and moved on inventing their own stories, an accident, maybe, or a house fire, but no one ever asked. And Emily never volunteered. What no one knew was that the scars were from an IED explosion in Ramadi, Iraq back in 2006. At the time, Emily was Sergeant Emily Carter, a U.S. Army combat medic attached to the 3rd Infantry Division. She had been decorated for valor, earning both a Bronze Star with V device and a Purple Heart, but she had walked away from the military and public life when her body was discharged and her heart never fully healed. Those medals now sat in a drawer in her small apartment above the laundromat, gathering dust, beside a photograph of the squad she saved but rarely spoke about. For the last 3 years, Emily had built her life around quiet repetition. She worked the morning shift, kept her head down, and made sure she never called attention to herself. Lonnie, the diner's owner, had hired her without questions, and she'd returned the favor by becoming his most reliable waitress. Locals had grown used to her presence, but never really knew her. And that suited Emily just fine. Here in this small, windblown town, she wasn't a veteran or a hero. She was just the woman with the steady hands, the unreadable eyes, and the scars that told a story no one had taken the time to hear. Each morning at Lonnie's diner began the same way: the hiss of bacon on the griddle, the clink of porcelain coffee cups, and the creak of the front door as early customers shuffled and moaned. But for Emily Carter, the true start of her day came with the heavy thud of steel-toed boots, followed by the laughter. Loud, careless, biting. The pipeline contractors were back, same as always, dragging mud noise and mockery in their wake. They sat at the largest booth near the front window, their orange vests flung over the seat backs and their voices rising above the din. As Emily approached with the coffee pot in hand, she braced herself, not for hot plates or rude customers. That was easy. What she steeled herself against was the sting of words, sharp and deliberate, aimed like arrows at wounds they didn't understand. Morning Scarface, one of them barked. It was Chad, the loudest and cruelest. Try not to spill any on me. Don't want to catch whatever turned you into that. Laughter erupted around the table. Emily didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady as she poured coffee into their mugs, her eyes trained on the liquid, not their faces. She had learned a long time ago that silence was a stronger defense than any retort, especially when the goal wasn't conversation, but humiliation. What was it? Another one sneered. House fire? Or did someone do that to you? Maybe you got into it with a lawnmower, the others chuckled. Emily adjusted the sleeve of her white uniform shirt as she stood. It didn't matter how she dressed or how many buttons she fastened, some of her scars always peeked through. Angry lines across her neck and shoulder, a twisted reminder of Ramadi 2006. A blast, a choice, a life saved. But that wasn't what they saw. They didn't see the medic who had once thrown herself across a wounded soldier while enemy fire cracked overhead. They didn't know about the Bronze Star or the Purple Heart tucked away in a drawer beneath worn socks and folded shirts. All they saw was what was left, skin rewritten by fire and silence they mistook for weakness. Emily finished taking their orders, her voice steady and professional. 2 plates of eggs over easy sausage links, wheat toast, 1 stack of pancakes, 1 chicken fried steak. Anything else? Yeah, Chad said, leaning forward with a smirk. A paper bag for your face. Even some regulars winced at that one. But still no one spoke. Not the older couple in the corner booth. Not the trucker at the counter pretending to read the sports section. Not Bob, the manager, who was surely within earshot. The diner had become complicit in its silence. Emily's jaw tightened just slightly, but her eyes never changed. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her back straight. Every step forward was a step away from that booth, from their ignorance, from the shame they tried to pin on her. Inside the kitchen, she paused for a breath before passing the ticket to the cook. Her hands, those same hands that had packed wounds, steadied IVs, and written death notes in the field, now placed orders for hash browns and eggs. She reminded herself these were just men. Civilian men. Men who didn't know what it meant to bleed next to someone, to lose someone, or to survive something that should have ended you. She'd faced mortars, not mouthy men. She'd seen what real fear looked like, and it wasn't Chad and his buddies in a diner booth. Still, it hurt. The loneliness, the daily bite of being misunderstood. The ache wasn't from her injuries anymore. It was from invisibility, from being nothing more than the scarred waitress in the eyes of people who never asked who she really was. As the orders sizzled behind her, she looked through the service window and saw the boy again, the little one who came in with his parents every Friday. He was watching her, his innocent eyes tracking her every move with a kind of curiosity that wasn't unkind, just curious. Once he'd asked her, did it hurt, pointing gently at her scars? And she'd smiled and said, not as much as being forgotten. It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. The battlefield was behind her. What she carried now was the weight of being unseen. Back on the floor, Emily delivered the plates to the contractors without a word. Chad frowned at his eggs. Cold, he muttered, poking at them with a fork. Maybe if you moved faster, we wouldn't get half-dead food. Would you like me to bring you a fresh plate? Emily asked. Don't touch it, another man said, recoiling from her hand. Who knows what kind of diseases you've got with skin like that? The words fell like stones. Not one person laughed this time. The silence in the room thickened, no longer indifferent, but uncomfortable, like the entire diner had realized in that moment that the cruelty had gone too far. Emily took the plate and walked it back to the kitchen. She said nothing. No tears came, not anymore. She had long ago run out of those. Instead, she reached back into her memory to the day in Iraq when she had knelt beside a bleeding corporal and whispered, "You're gonna be okay, I've got you." That moment, the grit in the air, the weight of her gear, the smell of blood and burning metal, that was real. That was when she mattered. She didn't need their kindness. She didn't need their recognition. But some days she wondered how much longer she could keep going without either. Still, Emily came back out with the fresh plate of eggs, setting it down with care and a simple, "Here you go." Then she turned and kept working, her spine unbent, her dignity untouched. Because beneath the apron and the uniform, beneath the stares and the silence, lived a woman who had faced hell and walked out the other side. And no insult in a diner booth could undo that. As the door to the diner creaked open and the bell gave its familiar jingle, Emily Carter didn't even look up from her tray of fresh coffee pots. The routine was a comfort one she had perfected over 3 years of quiet labor at Mel's Roadside Diner. But Michael Kelly wasn't just any traveler passing through West Texas. Something about him immediately shifted the air. He moved with a quiet authority, his weathered Marine Corps cap hinting at a life shaped by combat, and his eyes sharp and alert scanned the room as if it were a battlefield. When his gaze landed on Emily, it paused, tightened, then softened. He didn't know why yet, but something about the woman moving gracefully between tables stirred a memory buried beneath years of dust and survival. Emily brought him his coffee with the same quiet professionalism she showed every customer. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice neutral, steady. Michael nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he caught a glimpse of her forearm, just a faded edge of ink barely visible beneath the sleeve of her uniform. It was enough to pull a thread loose in his memory, a tattoo old and worn, but unmistakable to anyone who'd served in Ramadi. "Third to fifth," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. Emily froze, her posture still, only her eyes flicking toward him before moving away again. "I don't talk about that," she said quietly, turning to leave. But Michael wasn't going to let her walk away, not at this time. "Ma'am," he said louder now, just enough that heads began to turn. "Did you serve with the 3rd Infantry Division, 5th Brigade Combat Team in Ramadi, 2006. The diner grew noticeably quieter. Forks paused mid-bite. Conversations halted. Emily turned back slowly, the tray still balanced in her hand, her expression caught between resignation and cautious curiosity. "Yes," she said, her voice low, her eyes fixed on him. "2 tours. Medic." Michael's face changed completely, his tough exterior melting into something raw and grateful. "You saved my life," he said, his voice catching in his throat. "March 15th, 2006. Route, Michigan. IED blast. You threw yourself over me, kept pressure on my chest until the medevac came." Emily blinked, the memory sharp as broken glass. She had saved so many. She hadn't let herself remember individual faces. But this man, his voice, his eyes, it was all coming back. I remember, she said finally, you wouldn't stop asking about your team. You were bleeding out and still worried about everyone else. Michael stood slowly, placing his cap over his heart. They all made it, he said, voice steady now, because of you. The diner was silent, the usual clatter replaced by stunned disbelief. Even the contractors, those who had taunted her for weeks, had gone still, their smirks erased by the weight of truth. Emily stood frozen, unsure what to do with the sudden shift in energy. For years she had hidden, kept her head down, choosing silence over pity or questions. And now, in one moment, her carefully guarded identity had been revealed not by accident or pity, but by genuine recognition. Michael's voice rose slightly, addressing the entire diner now. This woman, Emily Carter, isn't just your waitress. She's a decorated Army medic. She saved my life under enemy fire. She has a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star with valor. And for the past 3 years, you've let her be humiliated while she poured your coffee. The contractors visibly flinched. One of them, Mohad, the loudest, opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He stared at Emily with a dawning horror, realizing his jokes had been daggers in the back of someone who had sacrificed everything for people like him. Emily looked around the room, feeling the shift in their eyes, from judgment to shame, from dismissal to awe. She didn't want a spotlight, but she also didn't want to be invisible anymore. I didn't do it for medals, she said, her voice firm, clear. I did it because it was my job, because there were people bleeding, and I knew how to stop it. The elderly couple in the corner stood slowly, the man removing his cap. Thank you for your service, Sergeant, he said solemnly. Others followed, some clapping softly, others just nodding with tears in their eyes. Even the cook peeked from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron with a look of disbelief. Bob Johnson, the diner's owner, came forward next, his voice thick. Emily, I'm ashamed I didn't know. I should have stood up for you. From now on, anyone who disrespects you in this place won't be welcome here again. Chad approached, his face flushed with guilt. I'm sorry, he muttered, his earlier arrogance gone. We didn't know. Emily looked at him, tired but firm. You shouldn't have to know someone's story to treat them with decency, she replied. You just have to choose not to be cruel. Michael stepped closer to her, offering the kind of silent support that only a fellow veteran could give. You don't have to hide anymore, he said. You don't have to carry it all by yourself. For the first time since her discharge, Emily felt the burden on her shoulders lighten, not because her scars were gone, but because they were finally understood. And in that moment, surrounded by silence, respect, and long overdue recognition, Emily Carter stood a little straighter, not as a waitress hiding in plain sight, but as a soldier finally seen. The moment Michael Kelly's voice echoed through Mel's Roadside Diner, naming Emily Carter, not just as a waitress, but as the combat medic who saved his life in Ramadi, something shifted in the air like the first crack in a dam before the flood. For 3 years, Emily had walked those tiled floors unnoticed, except for the cruel remarks and sideways glances. But now, every pair of eyes in the room stared not at her, scars with pity or disdain, but with a dawning reverence that left them speechless. Michael stood tall beside her, marine cap in hand, his voice unwavering as he recounted every detail: how she had pulled his bleeding body from the wreckage, how she'd worked for 40 harrowing minutes while under fire, how every man in his unit had made it home because of her. You don't understand, he said to the diners, his voice rising with restrained emotion. This woman right here, Emily Carter, is the reason I'm standing before you today. And she did it without ever asking for recognition. Silence gripped up the diner like a held breath. Even the usual clatter of dishes seemed to pause. At the corner booth, Mr. and Mrs. Jennings, an elderly couple who had eaten there every Saturday for 5 years, stood up slowly. Mr. Jennings removed his veteran's cap with trembling hands. We had no idea, he whispered. God forgive us for not seeing her sooner. Emily's cheeks flushed, not from shame this time, but from the sudden exposure of a truth she'd buried under layers of humility and pain. She'd only ever wanted peace, normalcy, but now her past had found her in the most public way possible. And yet, as she looked around at the faces she'd served coffee to for years, she saw something she hadn't expected: regret. Real, honest regret. Chad, the ringleader of the contractors who had tormented her for months, stood with his arms at his sides, his eyes wide and glistening. "Ma'am, Sergeant, I didn't know," he stammered. "That doesn't make it right, I know that. We were wrong. I was wrong, I'm so sorry." Emily studied him for a moment, seeing not the cruel man who had mocked her, but a broken one who had finally been forced to see himself clearly. "You are," she said quietly. "But what you do next matters more than what you did." Chad nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "I get that now." The other contractors shifted awkwardly, some lowering their heads, others murmuring apologies. One reached for his wallet and placed $200 bills on the table. "For your trouble," he said, but Bob Johnson, the diner's owner, stepped in swiftly. "She doesn't need your hush money," Bob snapped, his voice carrying a righteous anger that had been building for some time. "What she needs is respect. What she deserves is what we should have given her from day one." He turned to Emily, his jaw set firm. "You've got the rest of the day off with pay, and from now on this place is a zero-tolerance zone. Anyone who disrespects you walks out the door." "That's a promise." The other patrons murmured in agreement, a few even standing to clap softly, unsure of what else to do in the face of such overwhelming emotion. One trucker, a regular named Gus, who had never said a word to Emily beyond ordering his eggs over easy, stepped forward with tears welling in his eyes. "I've been sitting here watching and saying nothing for months. I ain't proud of that. We should have had your back, Emily. You had ours before we even knew your name." His voice cracked and he quickly turned away ashamed. Emily felt her throat tighten. She had braced herself for judgment, for the exposure to bring a wave of discomfort. But not this. Not gratitude. Not solidarity. Not the long line of diners who now approached her one by one, shaking her hand, offering words of thanks and promises to do better. And when a young boy no more than 7 tugged at her apron and said, "Thank you for being brave," Emily finally let a tear slip free. "You're welcome," she whispered, ruffling his hair. "Always." Michael remained by her side, his steady presence like a shield. "They see you now," he said gently. "Not just the scars, the story, the strength." Emily nodded, barely able to speak. "It's a lot," she managed, "but maybe it's time." At that moment, the bell above the diner door rang again, and a young woman in an army dress uniform entered, clearly having heard the tail end of the commotion. She looked at Emily, her eyes wide with recognition, and snapped to attention. "Sergeant Carter," she said with reverence. "You were my instructor at Field Medic School in San Antonio. I graduated because of you." Emily stared stunned. "Lily?" she asked. "Private Ramirez." The young woman smiled. "Now Specialist Ramirez, and still following in your footsteps." The moment was too much for Emily to process. Here she was just trying to pour coffee and disappear into a quiet life, now being confronted with her own legacy, a ripple of service and sacrifice that had spread far beyond the battlefield. The entire diner watched the exchange, visibly moved. A transformation had taken place in that dusty corner of West Texas. The people who had once looked away now looked up. The customers who had once ignored her scars now saw them as symbols of something greater. The redemption wasn't just for Emily, it was for all of them, for the silence they had kept, the cruelty they had allowed, and the humanity they had nearly lost. By the time Emily stepped outside for a breath of air, the sky had turned gold with afternoon light. Michael followed quiet for a moment before saying, "It took guts to serve, Strum, but it takes even more to stand here now and let them see you." Emily looked out across the flat Texas landscape and then back toward the diner where a small crowd had begun to place their hands on their hearts and whisper her name with reverence. "Maybe it's time they did," she replied softly. And for the first time in years, she didn't pull down her sleeve. In the months following that unforgettable morning at Mel's Roadside Diner, Emily Carter's story reached far beyond the dusty roads of West Texas. News outlets picked up the tale of the humble waitress who had once been a battlefield angel, and people across the country were moved by her quiet strength. But for Emily, the real transformation wasn't in the headlines, it was in the healing. She began volunteering at the local VA clinic, helping other veterans navigate their medical needs and the overwhelming shift to civilian life. Her scars, once sources of shame, became symbols of resilience and empathy. The diner became a sanctuary for service members, with Veterans 8 free nights and a wall of honor proudly displaying photos of local heroes. Even Chad and his crew, those who once ridiculed her, organized a charity fundraiser in her name, raising thousands for wounded veteran support programs. Emily had once tried to disappear into anonymity, but now she was living her second mission, helping others find the recognition and respect they deserved. This story reminds us that courage doesn't always look like a headline or a parade. It can walk quietly among us, disguised in a waitress uniform and a humble smile. If Emily Carter's strength moved you, share her message, leave a comment honoring a veteran you know, and subscribe for more stories that restore faith in humanity. Because sometimes all it takes to change a life or a nation is to finally see the hero standing in front of you.